Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Tara Victor, a neuropsychologist and professor of psychology at California State University, Dominguez Hills. I'm delighted to be here and welcome you all to this collaborative symposium, which seeks to explore the topic of fake news from multiple expert perspectives. This is a timely exploration and arguably an essential one, as many citizens in the United States have many questions about fake news. Where is this false information coming from? How does it spread, and how can we spot it? With me are four panelists particularly poised to answer some of these questions. So let me start by welcoming them as we begin this virtual presentation entitled Fake News, a Historical Analysis and a Snapshot of Attitudes and Behaviors in the United States. Dr. Mark Carrier is a professor of psychology at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He earned his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of California, San Diego. Together with his colleagues in the George Marsh Applied Cognition Laboratory, he studies the impact of technology use on people's lives. Dr. Nancy Cheever is also a professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills in the Communications Department, as well as a media psychology researcher who specializes in media literacy, smartphone addiction, multitasking, and media effects. Dr. Cheever's research on smartphone addiction has been featured on the news programs 60 Minutes and Good Morning America, on the documentary series America Inside Out with Katie Couric on the National Geographic Channel, as well as NPR's Crawford Family Forum, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and many other news outlets and documentaries. She is the recipient of both the 2018 Presidential Outstanding Professor Award at Cal State Dominguez Hills and the 2018 CSU Faculty Innovation and Leadership Award. Dr. Nolan Higdon. Dr. Higdon is a history and media studies expert, author of the recent book, Anatomy of Fake News, and the co-host of the Along the Line podcast. His areas of specialty include digital culture, news media history, and critical media literacy. Dr. Higdon is a founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. He sits on the board of the Action Coalition for Media Education and the Northwest Alliance for Alternative Media and Education. His most recent publication, The Anatomy of Fake News, a Critical News Literacy Education, was published by the University of California Press in 2020. Dr. Helen Kiso. Dr. Kiso is an assistant professor of psychology at Susquehanna University. As a lifespan developmental psychologist, Dr. Kiso has experience with variations and diversity in decision-making. She is specifically interested in age-related thoughts and behaviors relevant to making important decisions that affect one's future. So welcome. I think I speak for the viewers when I say I want to first just thank you all for choosing to elaborate on this very important topic. To provide further context for our viewers and just to get us started here, let's move on to a clarification of terms. How is fake news being defined in this context? Maybe we can start with the historical perspective and then view it from a psychological perspective. So Dr. Higdon, do you mind getting us started?
Absolutely. I define fake news any false or misleading content that is presented as legitimate journalism or a news story. I find that helpful because if you really break fake news down, it's saying that what is posed as news is not news, right? It's fake. So in that way, it's kind of an umbrella term for rumors, lies, hoaxes, bunk, satire, parody, misleading, imposter, fabricated, and manipulated content. It's a big umbrella term. And of course, that leads to some problems. Folks use it in different ways. Sometimes they say fake news, they mean misinformation. Sometimes they say fake news, they mean disinformation. Or in the case of Donald Trump, he used it to basically categorize anything he found personally or politically problematic. So when Trump says fake news, he's not talking about false information posing as journalism. He's talking about content he wished didn't exist and or people wouldn't believe because it's problematic for him.
And Dr. Carrier, if we could hear from you next, how are you defining fake news?
Well, I'm going to share with you that we did a large study of how everyday internet users interact with what we might call fake news. And so we have an operational definition of fake news for us. Our study had a little more than 2,000 participants, mostly from our part of the country. We collected all the data prior to the pandemic. So we called one type of behavior mild faking, and we measured it in a bunch of ways, but these were fairly common among regular internet users. So, for example, almost 38% of our sample said that they had read news and only later found out that it was fake. So they incorporated that information into their memories. About 30% actually lied some information they found online and then later found out that it was fake. So these are the two most common kind of ways of participating in the spread of mild fake news. And then we measured some rarer behaviors that we had found during pilot studies that didn't happen quite as much, but they still happen in the regular population. So the top rare faking behavior was actually using someone else's profile pic as your own. And almost 8% of our participants reported doing that at least one time in the past month. And then the second most frequent of rare faking behavior was people reporting that they made fake Facebook accounts or fake Twitter accounts, with about 4 to 5% of our sample reporting doing that at least one time in the past month.
Wow, I know there's more data to come later in the presentation, but I'm still interested in defining this term fake news. Dr. Kiso, how are you defining fake news?
So I agree with everyone, and I would probably also add that I would define it as something that individuals read or take in incorrect information, and with the belief that they believe that it's true. And if that gets debunked, sometimes people will still feel that it is true, and will still go back to that information. Might it be through conversation or through sharing that same link, even though it's been debunked, and seeing it again as that correct information, even though it's been false. So that in and of itself has a big impact on false information.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Cheever, I wonder if you could help us get even more specific about this question. What are different types of false online information?
Well, Dr. Higdon provided quite a few different examples of types of information, but also the Columbia Journalism Review recently produced a list of no fewer than 1,000 active websites with varying levels of false information. They range from political biases, rumor, satire, to fake news, conspiracy theories, and hate speech. Other types include, foreign actors interfering in elections, echo chambers, opinion pieces that masquerade as journalism, and then so-called news organizations that are actually propaganda machines for extreme views. Then there's deep fake, where a person's likeness is altered and used in a video to spread false information. Fake news producers often try to trick the public into thinking or doing something that they normally would not think or do, or to question something that they normally would not question. And of course, this leads to many problems. A lot of fake news is actually easy to spot if you know where to look. However, fake news articles that are, posing as real journalism are very problematic because they look real, and most people don't actually check to see if the news that they're reading is accurate. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. The other type of fake news that's not really easy to spot is called frames, related to framing theory, which are ways of presenting stories that kind of skew reality, such as repetitive storylines, repetitive images that in turn cause people to think differently about the topics that are represented in these frames. And without the tools needed to recognize fake news, people might make poor choices regarding a variety of issues and their own, ideologies and values.
Yeah. And do you have some specific examples of false online information?
Yes, I do. You know, most of the popular examples can be traced to major events like the pandemic and the election. In the months leading up to the 2016 election, false news stories on Facebook were shared and liked and commented more than the real news stories about the election from the 19 major news outlets. And some examples, users engaged a lot with the story about the Pope endorsing Donald Trump, with almost 1 million shares, reactions, and comments. The story of the WikiLeaks confirming that Hillary Clinton sold weapons to ISIS. That was almost 800,000 shares, reactions, and comments. And then, of course, you know, there's the election false news, which led to some really horrific actions, such as the storming the Capitol. A couple read about the benefits of fish tank cleaner to cure COVID, and the man actually passed away. And then, of course, there's Pizzagate, which we all remember. And regarding frames, what I was talking about earlier, this example here shows, you know, the same event. This is from Hurricane Katrina, and it shows two different news organizations framing the event. And it's obvious that the gentleman at the top has darker skin, and that person is framed as looting a grocery store. And then the folks at the bottom are clearly white folks, and it says 2 residents wade through chest deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. So they're almost identical photos in the content, right, in the context. But the gentleman at the top is framed as looting, and then the folks at the bottom are finding information. So this is just a really good example of framing. And then, you know, of course, we also have the example of people thinking that vaccines are harmful, which has been scientifically proven that they're not. And so, you know, those are just some of the major examples from the news.
Yeah, thank you. Those examples are quite illuminating. You know, I think that probably additional examples will come up, you know, as we move throughout the symposium. But let me turn back now to the full panel and ask, why do you think fake news has become such a major topic in the media today? How do you explain its popularity? Dr. Higdon?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the reasons I sort of wrote the anatomy of fake news is that false information has existed for as long as humans have existed. Our ability to imagine and create also gives us the ability to fabricate and believe fabrications. It's been around forever. So I think the real question is, why was there this moral panic about it post 2016? And I think in a lot of ways, fake news became simultaneously influential on popular culture. We saw this with like the Fake News Hour hosted by Ted Nelms, the fake news game show in Britain, and Murphy Brown returning with fake news. So it became like this kind of popular topic. But I would go sort of deeper and say that the moral panic over fake news became a convenient scapegoat to ignore a lot of the shortcomings of those in power. I think rather than kind of self-reflect on the Democratic Party agenda or the reality of policy during 8 years of Obama or the problems of Hillary Clinton, it's much more convenient to blame the Russians and internet users for the electoral outcome. Simultaneously, you know, Donald Trump, when he's exposed for misogyny and racism or his own ineptitude, it's a lot more convenient to blame it on the quote unquote liberal fake news media. And so I think in that way, we've sort of, those in power became comfortable weaponizing it. I also think us as citizens, it gave us a convenient way to look at our society and say, no, it's not that our society is structured wrong. It's not that we're doing our part in democracy. It's that these people are just lost. They're reading fake news and there's no way we can ever recover them. So I think at some level, fake news is clearly a threat, and the data from the other panelists and my data clearly show that. But on the other hand, I think it's really been popularized simply because it's a convenient weapon for a lot of folks.
Thank you. Yeah, and Dr. Cheever, do you have anything else to add to this question? And why do you think fake news has become such a major topic in the media today?
Well, I think that I agree with Dr. Higdon, and also that, people are starting to realize that it exists. And so I think it's becoming part of the discourse, right, in American culture. We're all talking about it. And I think that's why it's become a major topic, which is, I think, a great first step in, realizing that it exists and then trying to do something about it, right? The amount of fake news is at an all-time high. And in fact, during the 2020 elections, most of the misinformation on social media came from not the Russians, but our president. He produced most of the fake news during the 2020 election. So, accuracy is really the foundational principle of journalism. Without it, people are unable to understand what's true and what's fake. So I think it's really great that people are now understanding that it exists, and that's why we're talking about it so much.
And you're all kind of pointing to this already, but let's turn our attention to this topic of the real world implications of fake news production and consumption. If I can ask each of you, what are the possible consequences for not addressing false online information? Dr. Higdon?
Yeah, and I'll go back and say that I think Dr. Cheever gave an amazing list of these different types of fake news and a bunch of excellent examples. And one of the ones that she sort of, Dr. Cheever said that I think can frame the outcomes of fake news was Pizzagate. And Pizzagate, for those who don't know, is a story of, I think he was a 34-year-old man from North Carolina who read these false stories about the Democrats hiding this pedophilia ring, among other crimes, at this pizza restaurant in DC. And he drove up to DC and shot up the restaurant. What's left out of that story that I think is really important is that he was a father who had only recently gotten internet access in the home. So assume that the story was true, which it absolutely was not. If the story was true, this guy would be a hero, right? He drove to go liberate children from this abuse. And to me, that's a way to understand the power of fake news. It makes otherwise good people do horrible things in a lot of cases. And so what those horrible things can be is it can manipulate democratic outcomes. Some people can vote sometimes for their own feeling of safety or security at the expense of the lives of others. It usually is associated with marginalization of the press. Usually the fake news epithet quickly gets thrown at legitimate journalists. Historically, it's always been sows division. It's usually very divisive. Fake news usually causes moral panic and outrage. So you can see societies kind of freak out or overreact to things that may be true, but they've been amplified by fake news. It can radicalize users. Look at like Caesar Sayoc, right? This is a guy who just gets inundated with fake news over and over and over again, decides to then mail bombs to a member of the media and the Democratic Party. And then it's really closely associated with authoritarian regimes. When and Dr. Cheever brought this up in the beginning, I think it's a point worth returning to. When you start to blur the line between fact and fiction, democracy is really tough to maintain. And authoritarians really thrive in those environments when people are so confused on fact and fiction. So those are some, I think, the important outcomes of a society that's awash in fake news.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Dr. Kiso, who has the most to lose if online misinformation is not contained? I'm curious, are there certain groups or some groups who are more affected than others by fake news?
Yes, absolutely. So underrepresented groups definitely have the most to lose if online misinformation is not contained. They can lose representation, whether it be in the local, state, or even in the federal level. They can also lose access to things such as really important things, such as like healthcare, education, even rights. And groups that tend to be more effective tend to be women and people of color. But somehow older adults, based on older adults being baby boomers and older, have not really been as impacted based on what we've seen in our data, which was very interesting. But again, an interpretation could be that if it's through social media, maybe they may not be on social media as much. Therefore, they may be less likely to be targeted compared to a younger group. Think of Generation X and younger. So these are the groups that have the most to lose if it's not contained.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, I want to come back actually to both the question of identity and fake news as well as the impact of social media in just a bit. But before we do, Dr. Cheever, I believe you have more to add to this question about the implications of fake news. What scares you the most about this issue?
I think what scares me the most is that, rather than getting news and information through vetted sources, like in the olden days, most of today's information seekers look for information that confirms their interests and beliefs, right, or matches their interests. It's called confirmation bias, and this practice can have severe socio-political implications, as Dr. Higdon alluded to earlier. Because the information tends to polarize people. We've seen that a lot recently in the news. But what scares me even more about people in general is that their attitudes about fake news and their behaviors to mitigate its effects are in direct contrast to each other. Our lab conducted 2 studies 15 years apart that asked people about their fact-checking behaviors and attitudes. And the results were nearly identical. I'd like to share the results of our latest survey. So you'll see here that we asked people about their attitudes toward online information, right? And specifically about fake news. And we asked them, whether they think society must stay vigilant about people posting fake news, that it's important to understand how it happens so it can be prevented in the future, and that people should be checking whether the information is fake or not. And overwhelmingly, as you can see, 82 to 86% of the people agreed or strongly agreed that we should be doing all of these things. Then we asked people how frequently they do these various behaviors. All of these things can help people understand whether something is fake or not. So checking if the web page is from an organization or individual, when it was updated, the purpose, the credentials of the author, checking sources, checking for corroborating evidence, using a fact-checking website, and then following links on more than 3 pages, not just the ones that the search engine optimization is showing you. So there's a disconnect between the beliefs and the attitudes that people have and the actual behaviors. 82% of people that we surveyed, and we surveyed more than 2,000 people, they believe that society must stay vigilant about people posting fake news. And 86% agree that it's important to understand how it happens so that it can be prevented. 83% believe people should be checking whether the information is fake. But on average, 57% of the people never check to see whether the information they see is credible. And on average, only 20% check 1 to 2 times per week. Only 3% check more than 10 times per week. And of course, this could be due to their general behavior of how frequently they're online. But this is really startling to me, that there is this disconnect between people's attitudes and their behaviors.
Yeah, this disconnect between what people believe and how they behave, particularly around the checking behavior, is really fascinating, and it suggests we should take a closer look. Dr. Higdon, I was wondering if you could start helping us look at the history of the problem, and then maybe we can dive even more into the psychological data to better understand more of what's going on here.
Absolutely. As I kind of mentioned, fake news is as old as humans. It's been around basically for forever. In the United States context, we started to see fake news discussed as fake news. Starting in the late 19th century, you saw newspapers discussing fake news. This is interestingly occurring right at the time that national newspapers are starting to emerge in the U.S. and they lie the American public into the Spanish-American War. So that's where those kind of discourses start in the late 19th century. They really kind of die off after World War I. Here in the United States, they exist elsewhere. But they come back in the United States in 1992 when David Lieberman talks about these video news releases, or VNRs, which were essentially when corporations were making content to look like news broadcasts, but they were actually corporate advertisements. And Lieberman was pointing out that people struggle to tell the difference. And it's important because it's an example of how each new technological invention complicates fake news one way or another. And of course, this is where the internet, I think, is a game changer in the history of fake news. But if you look back at like academic studies that are 10 or so years or older, we really kind of mostly talk about fake news in the context of satirists like The Daily Show and things like that. It was only after 2016 that we started to take a lot more harder look at like fake news in terms of content that people are using.
Yeah, so this is really helpful. In other words, we're really attempting to take a novel look at an old problem. Dr. Carrier, how can we describe this problem from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to our study that we did, and we already knew from reading the literature about research, a lot of it based on laboratory studies of how people fall prey to false information due to cognitive biases. For example, Dr. Cheever mentioned the confirmation bias, which is definitely a problem when people go online. And we wanted to look more at how some general psychological factors are associated with behavior surrounding false information. So we looked at some things we've measured quite a bit in our lab. We looked at internet addiction, emotions, personality, a person's need for cognition, and their self-assessed executive function to see if those predicted any sort of behaviors around false information. And I'm just going to go through real quickly through a few of the behaviors that we studied. I mentioned mild faking before. So these were kind of everyday forms of behaviors that people do online that contribute to the spread or kind of the reach of misinformation and fake news. Internet addiction was definitely one of our top drivers of this behavior. And you'll see that this was a top driver of many of the behaviors. It was also driven a little bit by people's personalities. But this one was really interesting. We looked at the rare faking behaviors, like making a false Facebook profile or by using someone else's profile pic as your own. And this was emotionally driven. One of the biggest predictors was affect. So the more negative affect the person reported, the more likely they were to engage in these kind of rare, extreme faking behaviors. And if they had reduced positive affect, that also contributed to these behaviors. And then we looked at what we kind of call the skeptical behaviors. So people who, when they're presented with information online, they might do a little research to verify what they're reading before they endorse it or share it. The first one we call data collection, where people would actually maybe check out something on Snopes to see if it's real, or go to the CDC website to check out if what they're reading about COVID-19 is real. And here we found that there was actually a cognitive component to this behavior. People who had a greater need for cognition, which is kind of your desire to be intellectual and to be a thinker, those people were more likely to be doing this sort of skeptical fact checking. And the second kind of skeptical behavior we looked at was double checking the source of the information that you get. So is it a credible website? Is it a credible author, and so on? And again, this was driven by people's need for cognition. So need for cognition is really linked to wanting to be a skeptic of online information. And finally, we looked at what predicted people saying they'd been victimized by false information. And again, just being a compulsive internet user, the symptoms of internet addiction makes you more likely to be a victim of false information. But your emotional state or your cognitive state were really not factors. And there was some influence of personality, but not as great as internet addiction.
Yeah, interesting. So this really gives us a bit of information about how different types of fakers are making decisions, as well as the individual difference variables that impact the way we consume fake news. And it really begs the question, who are the generators of fake news? Where is this false online information coming from? Who's creating and spreading it? Dr. Higdon?
Yeah, my study looked at sort of where fake news originates from. One of the most general categories I had was sort of what I called these self-interested actors. That is, folks for reasons that serve their interests generate and spread fake news. This can be individuals who want to make a profit, like an Alex Jones or something, who in his divorce proceedings classifies himself as a performance actor, but online pretends to be a journalist. This can also be people who maybe want to get out of sticky situations. So we've seen incidents where people have falsely accused others of crimes and things like that. So self-interested actors create fake news. State-sponsored propaganda machines, that is, nation states, governments, pay for the construction and spread of fake news, including our own government. Right now on the internet, we're in the midst of an information war where fake news is being lobbed from one country to another. Satirists, as we mentioned, by definition, are fake news. They pretend to be journalists, usually for the purpose of lampooning mainstream culture. Political parties lie as well, which I know you'll all find as a shock. And they create these larger like propaganda apparatuses. And when I say apparatus, it's not just that politicians lie, it's that politicians get information from think tanks and corporations who want to lie, and they use the political class as a way to get those messages out. So it's a broad coalition of liars, if you will. And then look, legacy media perpetuates false information all the time. This can be select individuals such as Stephen Glass or Jason Blair, who made careers with fake news. Or these can be large-scale lies like conservative media's Stop the Steal, or certain excesses of Russiagate that perpetuated Democratic Party-leaning media. So all these different folks spread false information, and closely related to sort of the findings of my colleagues, that there's an interesting connection between the people who claim to be fighting fake news, generally are the ones who are also spreading it. So almost this list you have here on the screen is also a list of the people who are, claim to be fighting false information while simultaneously spreading it.
Dr. Carrier, same question. Who is the source of fake news? And I believe you have some recent data on the subject.
Yeah. So, Dr. Higdon is sharing with us kind of a outside of an individual level of where the fake news might come from, more of an organizational level. And in our data, we're able to look at whether fake news comes from everyday people, like when they go online. So it's kind of a different angle. And we did find that people are sharing, posting and sharing fake news online. However, through a cluster analysis of our 2,283 respondents, we placed them into 9 different types. And we found, interestingly, 2 types of people who are really spreading or generating and posting fake news the most. Regular everyday people, they're small groups. The cluster called faker contributors, these are people who are going online. They generate a lot of user-generated content. So that means they put a lot of information online in their everyday lives. 22 of those people out of our sample, and they're the highest in generating mild faking behaviors. And then we found a group of heavy fakers who were high in mild faking, but also high in those rare forms of extreme faking. And this is only 59 people. So one very interesting outcome here is that about 3.5% of our sample is responsible for being the most extreme fakers. So it's a small group, but they are fakers. And then another interesting finding among the many things I have on this slide is that these are the most politically extreme groups. The faker contributors, the small group of 22 individuals, are the least conservative group in our sample, most liberal, if you want to put it that way. And the heavy fakers are the most conservative group in our sample. So we found a link between extreme politics and also faking.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, oh, you have more data.
Yeah, just a little bit real fast. We also, just to look at the top predictors of mild faking and rare faking overall, as I said before, internet addiction is the biggest predictor. So compulsive internet use just drives all of these behaviors. But for mild faking and rare faking, attitude is also important. And Dr. Cheever and Dr. Higdon both mentioned this, that there's an attitude about wanting to fight fake news. And we found that that was a factor here, so that people who say they want to fight fake news are actually less likely to engage in mild faking and rare faking in our large study.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's zoom in even more on this question of identity now and fake news. I'm really curious about it. Dr. Kiso, can you perhaps start us off on this question? Like, for example, how are age groups impacted differently or similarly by misinformation online? Kind of started to speak about this earlier, and I wonder if we could revisit it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of already touched with older adults and what we found in our data regarding regarding being impacted by fake news. But when looking at younger adults, we find that we're seeing that media literacy is really important. So by adding a media literacy curriculum at schools can be really helpful. It's been around for decades. It's not something that's new, but it is relatively new in the United States. And it is something that is essential to continue and not just stop after just a few years, but something to continue on to be good critical thinkers. And again, this started kind of in 2016 with the media literacy curriculum. We started seeing a rise in that. There was also a study regarding online media with YouTube, where online media allowed younger adults to consume information, and younger adults are able to consume more information a lot more quickly because everything is at their fingertips through their phones and things of that nature. And a study on YouTube shown that being critical of videos actually increases with age. So we start to become more critical of that. And young individuals view themselves as really not being influenced by everything that they see in those YouTube videos, for instance, and that they are also aware that these videos can be influential. So there are some differences here with younger adults versus with what we discussed with older adults.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Dr. Higdon, I believe you have more to say on this subject as well, of identity and fake news. How have different races or ethnicities been affected by fake news throughout history?
Yeah, I can definitely answer. And I think Dr. Kiso is just absolutely correct in her analysis on media literacy. So I think it's worth restating. But to answer your specific question, yeah, usually in any society, the most vulnerable are going to be susceptible to the problems with fake news. So we can talk about some examples of race, certainly, but we should, also note that women have long been harassed by fake news, and there's tons of history there. But I'll sort of stick with race right now. If you think back to that list I gave of some of the generators of fake news, you can see the connection between fake news generators and race and racism in the United States. So speaking of like self-interested actors, there was Susan Smith, who was a white woman who blamed a black man for the death of her children. As it later turned out, she, of course, was responsible for the murder of her children. But just the idea that, as a white woman, she thought she could blame it on some black man who didn't exist and get away with it tells us something about our society in that context. State-sponsored propaganda machines, foreign governments like the USSR famously spread news stories here in the United States that the US government was infecting African Americans with AIDS. Our government has done these stories. For example, the White House set up a drug bust of a black drug dealer in Washington, D.C., right in front of the White House, so they could simultaneously criminalize blacks, as they were already doing through policy, and make it a big media stunt in front of the White House. Satirists have long sort of lampooned the United States and racism. The Onion wrote an article, How to Talk to Your Child About Racism, which hilariously points out the things that you shouldn't do when talking about racism. Political parties have race baited throughout the history of this country. We could do a whole panel just on that alone, but famous example was in the 2000 Republican Party primary for the presidency. In South Carolina, George W. Bush's campaign, led by Karl Rove, spread a story about John McCain fathering an illegitimate black child, which was believed to have been quite influential on voters in that state. And then the press has long also race baited one way or another. Just recently, Fox News altered a photo from Seattle and showed a video that was a month old from Minnesota claiming it was in Seattle to make it look like Black Lives Matter protesters were violent. This was happening in the midst of the post-George Floyd murder protests. So you can see how fake news has been used to perpetuate and further race and racism throughout the history of this country.
Yeah, so there appear to be both psychological and historical data to suggest different impacts on different groups of people. Dr. Kiso, you hypothesized earlier that perhaps certain individuals were less impacted as a function of their technology use or lack thereof. And one thing we haven't discussed yet is the role of social media. So Dr. Cheever, what are your thoughts on how social media plays a role in the spread of fake news?
I don't think fake news would be as prevalent as it is without social media. Just the mere fact of how easy it is to share information through social media, which is a new thing for in this modern era of fake news, right? This is how it's basically shared. From fake news posts that look like real news articles, as I mentioned before, to simply sharing a fake meme that goes viral. Social media and all sharing platforms, for that matter, are used by fake news producers because they know their posts can and will be shared. The more sensational ones obviously get shared even more. And so what we end up seeing is that fake news is actually shared and commented on and liked more than legitimate news. So, false information is getting more attention than legitimate news stories. And, social media just plays a huge part in that.
Dr. Higdon, same question. What are your thoughts on how social media plays a role in the spread of fake news?
Yeah, I think, Dr. Cheever, I think hit the main points. I guess I'll just add that, there's very little that's actually social about social media. That in itself is kind of a great weaponization. But also the ways in which these platforms are designed, we think of them as free and communication, sort of like tools, but really they're advertising tools. The purpose of these are to collect our data to get more insights about us, and then use that information to either predict or in some cases alter our human behavior. That's the goal. So with that kind of in mind, then it gets this question of like, what content keeps people on their screen? And as Dr. Kiso brought up earlier, what are people's levels of understanding of content? How do they analyze content, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a famous study in 2016 from a Stanford history education group that found that less than a fifth of middle school students could distinguish a news story from a sponsored story. even though the word sponsored was actually on the story. Less than a third of them could identify the implicit bias in the news article as well. And this is not just young people. Sure, students do struggle to evaluate content, as studies have found, but older citizens, when when they are confronted with false information, are 7 times more likely to share it than those aged 18 to 29. So all internet users suffer from this problem, and social media is kind of the perfect tool, if you will, to exacerbate these problems, as Dr. Cheever pointed out just a moment ago. And studies confirm that fake news is 70% more likely to spread on the internet than truth. Bots help amplify this content because these platforms are built in such a way that they privilege what you engage with versus what you need. Sometimes you need truth, but maybe truth is not the most engaging thing. Maybe Hillary Clinton is just like a boring, wonky politician. Maybe she's not that interesting, but that's not going to get you engaged. Talk about her having like a pedophilia ring, or maybe she murdered someone in her campaign. All right, now we're clicking, now we're interested. You got people engaged. And so it's that type of content that is amplified in social media, where the true content, largely because it's boring, is not. So to help us sort of like understand this, the way I like to describe it is that your internet experience has been really framed incorrectly. We often frame it as like this boundless access, right? We can access any information at any time. For the first time in human history, we can access all information from the comfort of our home. False. Your internet experience is more like a digital cave, if you will, right? So Plato told this allegory of the cave, where folks are in the cave and they see images on the wall from the light behind them, and one person leaves the cave and they come back in and tell the people who never left the cave, and they don't believe the person because they've never been in the outside world. That's kind of like your internet experience. You find, block, and customize the content and people you see, and the company's algorithms do the same thing for you. So you're locked into this very narrow world of content, yet you think you have like access to this boundless information. Shoshana Zuboff has referred to this as surveillance capitalism, as the kind of larger economic order that has led to this experience online. So then it becomes a question of, well, what do algorithms actually privilege, and how do they get information to users? Well, the companies recognize that digital news users prefer information that reinforces their view. So if you believe something that's false, search engines, social media feeds, they're going to keep feeding you that same information because the studies show you're more likely to click on it. They also recognize that from data collection, stuff that draws an emotional response from the user will get you to click and stay on your screen longer. So it's important to play to things like hate and fear, vision. Those are the things that get you going as a user. So fake news is just laden with those things. Those are the themes of fake news. And then to complicate matters, studies show that as the world becomes more complex, as we get all these different messages and we're on our screen and we're starting to get a little tired, because we've zoomed so long and we've stared at the social media feed, we start to rely on intuition rather than critical thinking. And this makes us a lot more susceptible to the false narratives online. Because they privilege messages that you like, that means if you're longer online, and we know folks stay online, between 10 and 16 hours, depending on the study, we're repeatedly told the same message over and over again. And studies show that repetition increases users' belief in false statements. So the more we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it's true. The more we see something, we think it's true because we conflate familiarity with veracity. And studies show we have a very difficult time rejecting false or misinformation, even when we're told it's false, if we've heard it over and over and over again. So this helps kind of explain why, despite all the concern over fake news, we still have a problem with users being able to discern fact from fiction. A 2019 study that came from that same Stanford history education group looked at 3,500 different people, and 52% of them believe that a grainy video showed strong evidence of voter fraud in the United States. The video actually wasn't even shot in the United States, it was shot in Russia. And only 3 of the 3,500 students bothered to even track down the original source of the video. So that same study, 2/3 of the students, again, couldn't tell the difference between news stories and ads, even though sponsored content was at the top of the content. And 96% of those 3,500 students did not consider a climate change website's credibility, even though it's stated that the fossil fuel industry had funded it. Fossil fuel industry, which has a vested interest in spreading and has been caught spreading misinformation and disinformation about climate change. Instead, students thought they could determine if something was true by looking at superficial markers, like was the site like aesthetically beautiful? Did it have a top-level domain? Did it come up in my search engine right away? Those are the ways that they determined something was true, which are all meaningless in terms of analyzing the veracity of content.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think we've done a really good job of defining the problem and the nuances of the problem. For the remainder of our time together, I was hoping we could focus on solutions. So Dr. Kiso, if you could pick only one way to address the problem of false online information and its implications, what would it be and why?
So I would say teaching media literacy in schools would be one way to address the problem of false online information. Um, and this can be for children, adolescents, really any age, even older adults. For children and adolescents, it could be something being added to the curriculum at their school. For older adults, there has been a study that has looked at that. And the researchers looked at low-income African Americans and those who had received training on how to learn about information did better when looking at the information and verifying it than those that did not. The researchers recommend that by having partnerships with like senior centers or institutions such as local libraries or any other school, if there happens to be one around that area, whether it be like higher education or high school, whatever it may be, that it can they can create like workshops to show them how to verify the credibility of the sources of information that is presented to them. So for me, that would be one way to address false online information.
Mm-hmm. And why is it so important for students to understand the concept of fake news or false information?
So most students tend to be on the younger end. When we're thinking about students, we think a lot of the times like K through 12, and thereby from the data that we collected, when for our data, this was to clarify, this was college age students, they are more committed to fighting against fake news, to verifying the credibility of websites, collecting data to counter the false online information, as well as even generate audience source material and be angrier and more suspicious about online news. So by providing training and access to learning about being more critical, it can have a positive impact on our future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and Dr. Cheever, same questions. If you could pick only one way to address the problem of false online information, what would it be and why?
Oh, absolutely. A more modern media literacy education. The people who are producing fake news aren't going anywhere. So the only way to mitigate its effects is really to educate people about it. And the old ways of identifying fake news are not working. As Dr. Higdon pointed out earlier, students are looking for poorly made websites and things like that. And that's just not an issue anymore. So I think, modernizing the media literacy education that we used to have, and I don't know if that's happening yet in the K through 12 education, I think that's one way to address the problem.
Okay. And also the question of why is it important for students to understand the concept of fake news or false online information?
Well, as has been pointed out earlier, several studies have shown that young children especially believe that all information is equal and they trust all information as the same. They don't understand that there's different kinds of information. So I think children can be taught about media literacy as soon as they begin to process information. And the same teachings of right and wrong, stranger danger, all the things that we teach young kids, they can be made aware that not all information that they read or are told is true. And they need to understand that critical thinking and questioning the information they see is really, important, without taking away the sort of common magical thinking that makes being a child so wonderful, right? So we don't have to crush their dreams, but I think there are ways of bringing media literacy into a child's life, and it can be as simple as just showing them ways to detect fake news, and as they grow, those tools can become more sophisticated. I think everyone wants their children to grow up as informed citizens who make the best decisions for themselves and their families. Regardless of their own beliefs, I think all people want their children to grow up as clear thinkers and responsible news consumers, and to use the internet in a way that's constructive and not destructive. With the amount of social media use and screen time at an all-time high, I think it's really important that parents understand also, not just educators, but parents, how to assist their kids in understanding how the media they consume can be harmful and have harmful effects down the road.
Yeah, I saw a lot of head nodding as you were on the panel, as you were talking. And so I'm curious, Dr. Higdon, from your perspective, whose responsibility is it to worry about fake information spreading online? And what's your opinion on purportedly neutral fact-checking websites like Snopes?
Well, first of all, let me say I totally agree with Dr. Kiso and Dr. Cheever. I think they gave a great rundown on the reasons for media literacy, and that was just excellent. I don't know if maybe we should crush their dreams. I don't know, Dr. Cheever. Just kidding. Okay. No, so to answer your question, whose responsibility is it? It's all of our responsibility. We live in a democracy. A democracy is a 24-hour-a-day job. And if you don't like it, there's a lot of authoritarian regimes who are looking for new servants. But in a democracy, we have to hunt down information, fact check it, and use it to make the most informed decision about, how to vote, whether to vote, how to protest, who to protest, what to support, what to oppose, all these kinds of things. Journalists give us that information, and fake news simply gets in the way of that process and complicates it. As I don't need to restate what Dr. Kiso and Dr. Cheever have said, but just to give a little more evidence for it. A moment ago, I talked about all those studies of students who, couldn't discern fact from fiction. There are other studies, though, that show when you do give students a critical thinking education about media content, they become very, very bold in their principles. And if you inundate them with false information, they'll stand their ground and say, no, that's fake. I can tell that's fake. They won't be nudged in the same way that folks who don't have that education. So we should be very confident in that. What we shouldn't necessarily be confident in is governments and industry trying to solve this problem for us. They're the ones who got us into this problem. I like to compare it to, handing out Budweisers at like AA meetings. These are the folks who caused this problem. I don't think that we need them in the room to try and solve it necessarily. There's no such thing as neutral fact-checking websites. There's neutrality doesn't exist. As Dr. Cheever sort of pointed out earlier, everything's kind of framed a certain way. Messages are delivered in a certain way. I think Snopes, PolitiFact, they do a pretty good job of trying to get as much content as possible to make an informed conclusion about the veracity of something. I wouldn't necessarily accept their conclusion, but I would use those websites as a starting point. So go to those websites to make a determination of what evidence are they presenting for their conclusion. Are you swayed by that evidence? Can you find other evidence? That can be a kind of a good way to go about that. And then also recognizing that sometimes we need to be comfortable with the fact that we simply don't know. So avoiding that impulse that I have to know, is it true or false? Sometimes you simply don't know. I mean, we see this right now with the so-called like lab leak theory. I have no credentials to tell you the veracity or falsehood of that theory. I just don't know. And it doesn't matter what Snopes says, we just don't know. So I think having that comfortability is also an important part of the process as well.
Okay. The importance of not knowing. It's definitely something to think about. And in general, we have a lot to digest here from multiple angles and levels of analysis. And thank you all for your insights. I really found myself appreciating the way your different views were complementing one another as we started to unpack this issue, which I know requires more dialogue. So thank you to all of you who have chosen to view this collaborative symposium. And the panel looks forward to continuing that dialogue virtually in the Q&A in August. So see you there.